Hi, I'm Sheila. For 7 years, I sat in a cell meant for my sister Amanda, watching the concrete walls close in on a life that was never supposed to be mine. My own father looked me in the eye and said, "Amanda has her whole future ahead of her. You're stronger. You can handle this." So I did. I took the plea deal meant for her, walked into that courtroom, and accepted a death sentence for a murder I didn't commit. But what my family didn't know was that DNA evidence doesn't lie, and neither do the records they thought would stay buried. Forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the visiting room hummed with that electric buzz that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. I sat across from my father, Robert, separated by thick, reinforced glass, both of us holding black phones that crackled, with static. His hair had gone completely gray since the last time I'd seen him, and deep lines carved themselves around his eyes like he'd aged a decade in 2 years. The orange jumpsuit they made me wear felt heavy against my skin, a constant reminder that I was property of the state now, scheduled to die for something I'd never done. He cleared his throat and looked everywhere except directly at me. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Neither of us knew how to cross. Finally, he spoke, his voice thin and strained through the phone. "How are you holding up in here, Sheila?" The question felt hollow, rehearsed, like something he'd practiced in the car before walking in. I stared at him for a long moment, searching, his face for any sign of the man who used to read me bedtime stories, who taught me how to change a tire in our driveway on Oak Street when I was 16. That man felt like a ghost now, replaced by this stranger who couldn't meet my eyes. "I'm surviving," I said finally. "That's what you wanted, right? For me to be strong enough to handle this?" His jaw tightened and he shifted in his plastic chair. Behind him, other families sat at their own stations, having their own difficult conversations, but none of them carried the weight that pressed down on our little corner of the room. "You know it wasn't about what I wanted," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The evidence was overwhelming. The lawyer said with your record, with the circumstances—" "With Amanda's record," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "You mean with Amanda's record? The drugs, the arrests, the fact that she was actually there that night. But we couldn't let golden child Amanda throw her life away, could we?" He flinched like I'd slapped him. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Amanda was young, she made mistakes, but she had potential." "And I didn't?" The words came, out louder than I meant them to, and a guard glanced our way with a warning look. I lowered my voice but kept my eyes locked on his. "I had a job, Dad. I was going to community college. I'd never been arrested, never been in trouble, but somehow I was the expendable one." Robert's shoulders sagged, and he finally looked directly at me. For a moment, I saw something that might have been regret flicker across his face. "Your mother always said you were the fighter. Linda used to tell me you could survive anything because you had that strength inside you that Amanda never had." When the lawyer said someone had to take responsibility, when he explained that Amanda would get life without parole or worse because of her priors, "So you decided I should die instead." The words hung in the air between us like poison. "You and Karen and her precious daughter Brittany all sat around the kitchen table and decided that Sheila could handle a death sentence, but Amanda was too delicate for prison." He was quiet for a long time, staring down at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We thought the appeals would work. We thought there would be time to figure something else out. We never believed it would actually come to this." I wanted to laugh, but nothing about this felt funny. 7 years, Dad. 7 years I've been sitting here while Amanda got to live her life. Where is she now? Still in Karen's good graces? Still the favorite daughter who could do no wrong? "She's married now," he said quietly. living in California. She has a little girl. The phone felt heavy in my hand. While I'd been counting down the days until my execution, Amanda had been building the life that should have been possible for both of us. She'd gotten married, become a mother, probably. Never thought twice about the sister who was dying slowly in a Texas prison cell so she could have her happy ending. Does she ever ask about me? I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. Robert shook his head. She doesn't talk about any of this. Karen thinks it's better for her mental health if she can move forward, put it all behind her. Of course she did. Karen had always been a master at protecting Amanda from consequences while making sure I faced every single one of mine magnified. Even when we were kids, if Amanda broke something, somehow it became my fault for not watching her carefully enough. If she got bad grades, I wasn't being a good influence. When she started using drugs in high school, Karen suggested I was probably supplying them, even though I'd never touched anything stronger than aspirin. The execution date is set for next month, I said, watching his face carefully. October 15th. Did you know that? His face went pale, and he gripped the phone tighter. The lawyer said there were still options, more appeals. There aren't. My voice came out flat, emotionless. I've been through 3 different attorneys, every appeal possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evidence was too clean, too convincing. Someone made sure it would be. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of confusion. What do you mean? Someone made sure. I'd been carrying this suspicion for years, this nagging feeling, that the evidence against me had been too perfect, too convenient. Physical evidence that placed me at a scene I'd never been to. Witnesses who suddenly remembered seeing me places I'd never been. Timeline inconsistencies that no one wanted to examine too closely. But every time I tried to bring it up, my court-appointed attorneys brushed me off as a desperate woman grasping at straws. Nothing, I said finally. Just prisoner paranoia, right? But as I looked at my father's face, I saw something I'd never noticed before. Guilt, yes, but something else too. Something that looked almost like fear. He knew something he wasn't telling me. Something that went deeper than just a family choosing to sacrifice one daughter to save another. The visiting time buzzer sounded. Sharp and final. Robert stood up slowly, looking older than his 62 years. I'll try to visit again before... He couldn't finish the sentence. Don't, I said, standing up as well. Don't come back here unless you're ready to tell me the truth about what really happened that night. All of it. He paused, his hand on the phone, and for a moment I thought he might actually say something real, something honest. Instead, he just nodded and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the sterile hallway as a guard came to escort me back to my cell. The walk back to death row was always the same. Long corridors painted that particular shade of institutional green that was supposed to be calming but just looked sick under the harsh fluorescent lights. My cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a narrow window that looked out onto the exercise yard where I was allowed to walk in circles for 1 hour each day. The walls were concrete block painted white, and I'd spent the last 7 years staring at them, memorizing every crack and stain. My cellmate had been transferred 2 months ago after her appeals ran out. They'd executed her on a Tuesday morning. While I was in the shower, and by the time I got back, her belongings were already gone, her bed stripped, and waiting for the next woman to count down her final days. The silence in the cell was somehow worse than her constant chatter had been. At least when Martha was here, the space felt human. Now it just felt like a tomb waiting for its next occupant. I lay down on my narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, thinking about what my father had said. Amanda was married now, had a daughter. She was living the life I should have had, The life I would have had if my family hadn't decided my existence was less valuable than hers. The anger that thought brought up was so familiar now it felt like an old friend, warm and constant in my chest. But tonight, something else was mixing with the anger. That look on my father's face when I mentioned the evidence being too clean, the way he'd shifted in his chair, the way his eyes had darted away from mine. In 7 years of visits, I'd never seen him look quite like that. Guilty? Yes. Ashamed? Absolutely. But afraid? That was new. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the night that changed everything. March 15th, 2017. I'd been working a double shift at the diner, covering for another waitress who'd called in sick. The restaurant was downtown, about 20 miles from where the murder happened, and I had time cards and witness statements proving I was there until after midnight. But somehow, my hair had been found at the crime scene. My fingerprints were on a glass in the victim's kitchen. Security footage from a gas station showed someone who looked like me buying cigarettes near the victim's house, even though I'd never smoked a day in my life. The victim was a woman named Patricia Reynolds, a local real estate agent who'd been found beaten to death in her home. She was 43, divorced, no children. The police said it was a robbery gone wrong, but nothing had been taken. Her purse was untouched, her jewelry still in place, her car still in the driveway. It made no sense as a robbery, but it made perfect sense as a setup. At the time, I'd been too shocked, too overwhelmed by the arrest and the legal proceedings, to think clearly about the inconsistencies. My court-appointed attorney was overworked and underpaid, and he seemed more interested in negotiating a plea deal than actually investigating the evidence. When my family started pressuring me to take responsibility to spare Amanda from the consequences of her actions, I was already so beaten down that it almost seemed reasonable. Amanda had been in trouble again, something involving drugs and the wrong crowd, and Karen was convinced that if Amanda got arrested again, she'd get life without parole under the 3 strikes law. But I had a clean record. If I took the blame, the lawyer said I'd probably get manslaughter, maybe 15 to 20 years with good behavior. It would ruin my life, but I'd survive it. Amanda wouldn't survive a life sentence, they argued. She was too fragile, too sensitive. She'd probably kill herself in prison within the first year. So I said yes. I pled guilty to second-degree murder and accepted a life sentence, thinking I was saving my sister's life and would serve my time quietly in some medium security facility. But then the judge decided to make an example of me. He talked about the brutality of the crime, about sending a message to other would-be killers, and suddenly my life sentence became a death sentence. By the time I understood what had happened, it was too late to take it back. The worst part was how relieved my family looked when it was over. Not sad, not guilty, but relieved. Like they'd successfully solved a problem that had been keeping them up at night. Karen actually smiled when the bailiff led me away in shackles, and my father's goodbye hug felt more like an obligation than affection. Now, lying in my cell with less than a month left to live, I was finally starting to see the bigger picture. The evidence hadn't just been convenient, it had been planted. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make sure I looked guilty, and they'd done it well enough that even a competent attorney might not have caught all the inconsistencies. But why? What had I done to deserve such an elaborate frame job? Unless it wasn't about me at all. Unless I really was just the expendable one, the family member they could afford to lose, so the valuable one could stay safe. The next morning brought the usual routine. Breakfast at 6, which was usually some variation of oatmeal or cold cereal, with milk that tasted like it had been watered down. Then, an hour of recreation time in the yard, where I walked laps alone while the other women on death row did the same. Most of us didn't talk much. When you're all waiting to die, small talk feels pretty pointless. But today was different. During recreation, one of the guards approached me with an official-looking envelope. Mail call Martinez, she said, using my last name like we were in the military. Looks important. The return address made my heart skip. Texas Department of Public Safety, DNA Laboratory Division. I'd been writing to them for years, requesting that they retest the evidence from my case using newer technology, but they'd always refused. Old case, already adjudicated, resources needed for current investigations. The form letters of rejection had piled up in my cell until I finally stopped trying. But this wasn't a rejection letter. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope and read the single page inside. It was brief, clinical, but the words jumped off the page like they were on fire. Re-examination of evidence from case number 2017-4471, State v. Martinez, has been completed using advanced STR analysis. Results indicate exclusion of defendant DNA from primary evidence samples. Full report attached. I read it again, then a third time, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Exclusion of defendant DNA. That meant the hair, the fingerprints, the blood evidence they'd used to convict me hadn't come from me. After 7 years of insisting I was innocent, someone had finally bothered to prove it. The attached report was 12 pages of technical jargon, but the conclusion was clear. The DNA found at the crime scene belonged to 2 different people, neither of whom was me. More importantly, one of the profiles matched a sample that was already in the system. A sample belonging to someone who'd been arrested multiple times for drug-related offenses. Someone whose DNA should have been checked against the evidence years ago, but somehow never was. My sister, Amanda. I sat down hard on a bench, the papers fluttering in my hands. All these years, while I'd been sitting on death row, the real killer had been living free in California, raising a family, probably never giving a second thought to the sister who was dying for her crimes. The evidence had been there the whole time, waiting for someone to care enough to look. But why now? Why had the lab suddenly decided to retest evidence from a 7-year-old case? I flipped through the paperwork again, looking for clues, and found my answer in a small notation on the final page. Testing requested by Detective Raymond Martinez, Houston PD, Cold Case Division. Approved for priority processing due to pending execution date. Martinez. The same last name as mine, but probably a coincidence. Still, someone named Martinez was trying to save my life, and I'd never been more grateful for a stranger's intervention. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Amanda's DNA was all over the crime scene, that meant she'd actually killed Patricia Reynolds. My family hadn't just asked me to take the blame for something Amanda might have done. They'd asked me to die for something she definitely had done. They'd known, all of them, that she was guilty, and they'd still convinced me to trade my life for hers. I thought about my father's visit yesterday, the fear in his eyes when I mentioned the evidence being too clean. He'd known this day would come eventually. They all had. Somewhere in the back of their minds, they'd always known the truth would surface, and when it did, they'd have to face what they'd done to me. But I wasn't dead yet. I had 23 days left, and now I had proof of my innocence. More than that, I had proof of who was really guilty. The question was what to do with it. The first call I made was to my attorney, a young public defender, named Jessica Torres, who'd been handling my final appeals. She'd seemed competent but overwhelmed, juggling dozens of death penalty cases with limited resources. When I told her about the DNA results, I could hear her sharp intake of breath through the phone. "This changes everything," she said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "I'm coming to see you this afternoon. Don't talk to anyone else about this until I get there, and definitely don't mention it to your family if they call. We need to move fast on this." The afternoon. Visit was different from the usual family meetings. Jessica sat across from me in a small conference room, surrounded by file boxes and legal pads, her laptop open and fingers flying across the keyboard as she talked. She was younger than me, maybe 28, with dark hair pulled back in a Severe burn and the kind of intense focus that made me believe she actually cared about keeping me alive. The good news is this DNA evidence is grounds for a new trial, maybe even an immediate stay of execution, she said, scanning through documents on her screen. The bad news is that someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure this evidence wasn't tested properly the first time around. This wasn't just sloppy police work. This was deliberate. What do you mean? She turned her laptop around so I could see what she was looking at. It was a copy of the original evidence log from my case, with a detailed chain of custody showing everyone who'd handled each piece of evidence. Look at this. The hair sample that supposedly came from the victim's hand? It was logged in as evidence, then signed out 3 days later for testing, then signed back in. But there's no record of what lab did the testing, and no report was ever filed. I studied the screen, trying to make sense of the bureaucratic language. So someone took the evidence and brought it back, but we don't know what they did with it in between. Exactly. And look at who signed it out. Her finger pointed to a signature on the screen, and my blood went cold. Detective Mark Stevens, my stepmother Karen's brother, and one of the lead investigators on my case. He's family, I whispered, and Jessica nodded grimly. More than that, he was the one who pushed hardest for your arrest. According to the case files, he was convinced you were guilty from day one, even when other detectives thought the evidence was thin. He kept pushing until the DA agreed to file charges. The room felt like it was spinning. My own family hadn't just asked me to take the blame, they'd actively worked to frame me. Uncle Mark had planted evidence, manipulated the investigation, and built a case against me that was strong enough to get a death sentence, all to protect Amanda from the consequences of her actions. There's more, Jessica said, pulling up another document. I've been digging into the victim, Patricia Reynolds. Guess who she was dating at the time of her murder? I already knew, but I needed to hear her say it. A guy named Tommy Briggs. He was arrested 6 months later for drug trafficking, and guess who his supplier was? Amanda. The word came out like a sigh. Amanda. According to police reports, Patricia found out about the drug operation and threatened to go to the police. She was killed 3 days before she was supposed to meet with federal investigators about a drug ring operating out of several real estate offices in the area. Everything was starting to make sense now. Amanda hadn't just killed someone in a moment of rage or desperation. She'd committed a premeditated murder to protect her drug operation. And when the investigation started pointing in her direction, the family had closed ranks around her and decided I was an acceptable sacrifice. How long do we have? I asked. Jessica checked her watch. I'm filing for an emergency stay first. Thing tomorrow morning. With this new DNA evidence, we should be able to get your execution postponed while we investigate further. But Shiela, you need to understand something. Even if we get you off death row, even if we prove your innocence, some of your family members are going to prison for this. Your uncle probably faces charges for evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. If we can prove your father and stepmother knew about the frame job, they could be charged as accessories. I thought about my father's gray hair, the deep lines around his eyes, the way he'd looked at me yesterday like he was saying goodbye to a ghost. Part of me felt sorry for him. Part of me knew that if I pursued this to the end, I'd be destroying what was left of my family. But then I thought about 7 years of counting down to my own execution. 7 years of watching other women die while I waited my turn. 7 years of living in a cage while Amanda raised her daughter and built her life on the foundation of my destroyed one. Do it, I said. File everything. I want them all to face what they did to me. Jessica smiled for the first time since I'd met her. I was hoping you'd say that, because I think we can not only get you out of here, I think we can put the real killer behind bars where she belongs. That night, I lay in my cell staring at the ceiling and thinking about justice. For 7 years, I'd been angry at the system that had failed me, at the lawyers who hadn't fought hard enough, at the witnesses who'd lied, and the evidence that had been manufactured. But I'd never been angry at the right people. I'd never understood that my own family had orchestrated the whole thing, had sat around their kitchen table and planned my death like they were deciding what to have for dinner. Tomorrow, Jessica would file papers that would stop my execution and start unraveling the web of lies that had put me here. Amanda would find out that her perfect life in California was about to come crashing down. My father and Karen would have to face what they'd done. Uncle Mark would probably lose his badge and his freedom. It should have felt like victory, but mostly it just felt like exhaustion. I was 32 years old, and I'd spent 7 of the best years of my life in a cell. Even if I got out tomorrow, I could never get those years back. I could never undo the trauma of living on death row, of watching women die, of believing I was going to die for something I didn't do. But I was alive. Against all odds, despite my family's best efforts, I was still alive. And tomorrow, I was going to start fighting for the life they'd tried to take away from me. The truth was finally coming out, and I wasn't going to let anyone silence it again. The emergency stay came through at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, exactly 18 days before my scheduled execution. I was eating breakfast when Guard Morrison appeared at my cell door with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Something that might have been hope. "Martinez, you need to come with me," she said, but her tone was different from the usual barked commands. Softer, somehow, like she was talking to a person instead of a number on a death row roster. The walk to the warden's office felt like it. Took forever, my shackled feet shuffling against the polished concrete floors while my heart hammered against my ribs. 7 years of appeals had taught me not to get my hopes up, but the DNA results had changed something fundamental. This wasn't just another legal Hail Mary. This was proof. Warden Collins was a thin man with silver hair and tired eyes who'd overseen more executions than he probably cared to count. He looked up from a stack of papers when I entered, and for the first time in our brief interactions over the years, he actually seemed to see me as a human being rather than a problem to be managed. "Ms. Martinez," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I have news that I imagine you've been waiting to hear for a very long time." The papers he slid across the desk were official court documents, heavy with legal terminology and official seals, but the key phrase jumped out at me immediately. Stay of execution, granted pending further investigation. Below that, in smaller print, was language about new evidence and potential miscarriage of justice, but I couldn't focus on the details. All I could think about was that I wasn't going to die in 18 days. "Your attorney will be here this afternoon to discuss next steps," Warden Collins continued. "In the meantime, you'll be moved to a different housing unit while this matter is resolved. Death row is no longer the appropriate placement for someone whose conviction is under this level of scrutiny." The new cell was in general population, which should have felt like a victory, but after 7 years of the structured isolation, of death row, the noise and chaos were overwhelming. Women talked constantly, shouted across the corridors, played music from small radios, and moved around with an energy that felt foreign to me now. I'd gotten used to the quiet desperation of death row, where everyone understood that time was running out and words felt precious. Here, time seemed infinite, and everyone used it carelessly. My new cellmate was a woman named Rosa who was serving 15 years for armed robbery. She was probably 45, with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes that suggested she'd found ways to make peace with her circumstances. When I told her where I'd come from, her expression shifted to something between respect and pity. "Death row, huh?" she said, sitting cross-legged on her bunk. "That's some heavy time. What did you do?" "Nothing," I said, and for the first time, in 7 years, I actually believed it when I said it. Absolutely nothing. Rosa studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "DNA evidence, right? I heard some guards talking, said someone's been covering up some serious stuff to keep you locked up." The fact that my case was already becoming prison gossip should have bothered me, but instead it felt validating. After years of everyone assuming I was guilty, having strangers believe in my innocence was like oxygen after holding my breath underwater. Jessica arrived that afternoon with a banker's box full of files and a laptop bag that looked like it weighed more than she did. The conference room they gave us was larger than the one where we'd met before, with actual windows that let in natural light. After 7 years of fluorescent bulbs and artificial everything, the sunshine felt like a miracle. "The stay is just the beginning," Jessica said, spreading documents across the table between us. "The state's attorney general is launching a full investigation into your case, and they've already started looking into Detective Stevens' handling of the evidence. But Shiela, what we're uncovering goes way deeper than just planted evidence." She opened her laptop and turned it toward me, showing what looked like bank records. "Your Uncle Mark received 3 payments of $5,000 each in the month before your arrest. The payments came from an account registered to something called Westside Properties LLC. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. "I don't understand. What's Westside Properties?" "It's a shell company," Jessica explained. "Technically, it was a real estate investment firm, but it was really a front for money laundering. The DEA shut it down 2 years ago. As part of a major drug trafficking investigation, the pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was uglier than I'd imagined." Amanda was working for them? Amanda was dating the guy who ran it, Tommy Briggs, the same one who was dating Patricia Reynolds when she was murdered. According to federal investigators, Westside was moving millions of dollars in drug money through fake real estate transactions. Patricia found out about it and threatened to expose the whole operation. Jessica pulled up another document, this one showing a timeline of events leading up to Patricia's murder. "Look at this." Patricia contacted the FBI on March 10, 2017, saying she had information about illegal activities in the real estate industry. She was scheduled to meet with federal agents on March 18th. She was killed on March 15th, 3 days before that meeting. "And 3 days after she first called them," I added, seeing the pattern. "Exactly. Someone knew about her contact with federal agents, and they knew they had to silence her before she could testify. The problem was, Amanda was the obvious suspect. She'd been dating Tommy, she knew about the money laundering, and she'd been seen arguing with Patricia at a real estate office just days before the murder. I thought about my sister as she'd been back then, always in trouble, always running with the wrong crowd, always somehow managing to avoid real consequences. So they needed a scapegoat. They needed someone who could take the fall without bringing down the whole operation. Someone clean enough that the charges would stick, but expendable enough that no one would look too closely at the evidence. The word expendable hit me like a physical blow. That's exactly what I'd been to my family. Not a daughter or a sister, but a resource to be used up when the situation required it. They'd calculated my worth against Amanda's and decided I was the acceptable loss. "There's something else," Jessica said, her voice getting quieter. "I've been going through your original case files, and I found something your first attorney should have caught. Do you remember being questioned about your whereabouts on the night of March 15th? "Of course. I was working at the diner until after midnight. I had time cards, witness statements, everything." "Right, but look at this." She showed me a police report dated 3 days after my arrest. "Your manager at the diner, Craig Williams, originally told police you'd worked a full double shift and didn't leave until 12:30 a.m. But then he changed his statement. In the revised version, he says you left around 10 p.m., which would have given you time to drive to Patricia's house." I remembered Craig, a decent guy in his 50s who'd always been fair to his employees. He'd seemed genuinely shocked when I was arrested, kept saying there had to be some mistake. Why would he change his statement? Jessica pulled up another document. Because 3 days after he gave his revised statement, the health department suddenly dropped a major violation they'd found during an inspection of the diner, a violation that should have shut the place down for weeks, but instead just disappeared from their records. The corruption was spreading out like ripples in a pond, touching everyone who'd been involved in my case. They hadn't just framed me. They'd systematically destroyed every piece of evidence that could have proved my innocence, while manufacturing evidence to support their narrative. How many people knew? I asked. How many people were in on this? I'm still figuring that out, Jessica admitted. But it's not just your immediate family. Detective Stevens obviously knew, and probably some of his colleagues. Someone at the health department. Maybe people at the DA's office. There's no way this case should have gone to trial with evidence this thin unless someone was pushing for it. I sat back in my chair, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what they'd done to me. It hadn't been a simple family decision to protect Amanda. It had been a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple government agencies and officials. They'd bent the entire system to ensure I'd take the blame for Amanda's crime. What happens now? I asked. Now we fight back, Jessica said, and there was steel in her voice. The state attorney general has assigned a special prosecutor to investigate potential corruption in your case. The FBI is looking into the connections between Detective Stevens and the Westside Properties money laundering operation, and we're filing a civil rights lawsuit against everyone involved in your wrongful conviction. What about Amanda? Jessica's expression hardened. Amanda is about to discover that her past has finally caught up with her. The FBI raided her house in California yesterday morning. By now, she's probably sitting in a federal holding cell, trying to figure out how her perfect life fell apart. So fast. The thought of Amanda in handcuffs should have brought me satisfaction, but mostly I just felt empty. 7 years of my life were gone, and no amount of justice could bring them back. But at least she'd finally face consequences for what she'd done, and maybe other people would think twice before deciding their family member was expendable. There's one more thing, Jessica said, hesitating like she wasn't sure she should. Tell me. I got a call this morning from someone who says he's been trying to help your case for years. Detective Raymond Martinez from Houston PD's Cold Case Division. He wants to meet with you. The name was familiar. He was the one who'd requested the DNA testing that had saved my life. He's not related to me, is he? No relation, just a coincidence. But apparently he's been following your case since the beginning, and he knows why your family was so willing to sacrifice you. That afternoon, Detective Martinez turned out to be a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of steady demeanor that suggested he'd seen everything and wasn't easily shocked. He sat across from me in the same conference room where I'd met with Jessica, but his questions were different, more focused on my family history than on the legal aspects of my case. Tell me about your relationship with your mother, he said, pulling out a small notebook. Linda Martinez. The mention of my mother's name brought up emotions I'd been suppressing for years. She'd died when I was 19, just a few months before my father married Karen, and I'd always felt like her death had marked the end of my real family. She was everything to me. After she died, nothing was ever the same. Did she ever talk to you about her past? About why she left California when you were young? I frowned, trying to remember. She said she wanted a fresh start, that California held too many bad memories. I always assumed it had something to do with my biological father. She never talked about him much. Detective Martinez nodded, making notes. Your mother left California in 1995 when you were 6 years old. She changed her name from Linda Castellanos to Linda Martinez, and she never looked back. Do you know why she changed her name? She was running from something, Shiela, or someone. Your mother witnessed a murder when she was 22 years old, and she testified against some very dangerous people. People who were connected to the same drug trafficking operation that Amanda got mixed up with years later. The room felt like it was tilting. You're saying this whole thing was connected to my mother? I'm saying your mother's past caught up with your family, And when it did, they decided you were the most expendable member. Amanda wasn't just dating Tommy Briggs by accident. She was specifically recruited because of her connection to Linda, Castellanos' daughter. My hands were shaking now. Recruited by who? By people who wanted revenge against your mother, but she was already dead. So they settled for destroying her daughter instead. The Patricia Reynolds murder was just the vehicle they used to do it. Everything I thought I knew about my case was crumbling. This hadn't been about protecting Amanda from her mistakes. It had been about using me as a weapon against my mother's memory. The people she'd testified against decades ago had finally found a way to hurt her, even though she was gone. Your family didn't just decide to sacrifice you, Detective Martinez continued. They were approached by people who made it clear that someone in your family was going to pay for Linda Castellanos' testimony. They could choose you, or they could let those people choose for them. So they chose me. They chose the daughter, who reminded them most of Linda, the one who had her strength, her stubbornness, her refusal to back down from what was right. In their minds, they were probably protecting Amanda, but really they were just saving themselves from having to make a harder choice. I thought about all the times Karen had told me I was just like my mother, in a tone that made it sound like an insult. All the times my father had seemed uncomfortable around me, like I reminded him of something he'd rather forget. I'd always assumed it was grief, but maybe it was guilt. The good news, Detective Martinez said, is that we now have enough evidence to bring down the entire network that orchestrated your frame-up. The bad news is that it's going to take time, and some of the people involved are powerful enough to make this fight very difficult. I don't care how difficult it is, I said. I've already survived 7 years on death row. I can survive whatever comes next. Detective Martinez smiled, and for the first time in our conversation, he looked hopeful. That's exactly what your mother would have said, and that's exactly why we're going to win this thing. That night, back in my new cell, I lay on my bunk and tried to process everything I'd learned. My mother hadn't just been a young woman looking for a fresh start. She'd been a witness in a major criminal case, brave enough to testify against dangerous people despite the risks. She'd spent my entire childhood looking over her shoulder, wondering if her past would catch up with us. And in the end, it had. Just not in the way she'd feared. Rosa was reading a paperback novel on her own, Bunk occasionally glancing over at me with concern. Finally, she put the book down and asked, "You okay over there? You look like someone just told you the world was ending." More like someone just told me it already ended a long time ago, and I'm just now finding out about it. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what I learned in here? The past is like a prison sentence. You can serve it, or you can let it serve you." Sounds like you've been serving other people's sentences long enough. She was right. For 7 years, I'd been paying for Amanda's crime, for my uncle's corruption, for my family's cowardice, and for my mother's courage. I'd been serving everyone's sentence except my own. But that was about to change. Tomorrow, Jessica would file more papers, Detective Martinez would continue his investigation, and the wheels of justice would keep turning. Amanda would face trial for Patricia's murder. Uncle Mark would face charges for evidence tampering and corruption. My father and Karen would have to explain their role in the conspiracy. And I would finally start serving my own sentence, not in a prison cell, but in the world outside, building the life they'd tried to take away from me. The truth was coming out, piece by piece, and for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready for it. I was ready to stop being the expendable daughter and start being the woman my mother had raised me to be. Strong enough to survive anything, brave enough to fight for what was right, and finally free enough to choose my own path forward. The phone call came at 3 a.m, 2 weeks after my stay of execution. I'd been sleeping fitfully in my new cell when Guard Morrison appeared at my door with an unusual expression. something between urgency and excitement. "Martinez, you've got an emergency call," she said, unlocking my cell. "Legal emergency. Attorney says it can't wait." I followed her down the corridor in my standard-issue pajamas and slippers, wondering what could be so urgent that Jessica would call in the middle of the night. The phone booth was the same one I'd used for years, to talk to my family, but tonight it felt different, charged with possibility instead of weighted with despair. "Sheila, thank God." Jessica's voice crackled through the receiver. "I'm sorry to wake you, but you need to hear this immediately. We just got a break in the case that changes everything." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, suddenly wide awake. "What kind of break?" "Tommy Briggs just contacted the FBI from federal prison. He wants to make a deal, and he's offering to testify about everything. The money laundering, Patricia Reynolds' murder, the frame job against you, all of it. But there's a catch." "What catch?" "He says he'll only talk to you first, face to face. He claims there are things about your case that only you need to know before he goes on record with federal agents." The idea of sitting across from the man who'd orchestrated my 7-year nightmare made my stomach clench, but I also knew this might be my only chance to get the whole truth. "When?" "Tomorrow afternoon. The FBI is arranging transport to bring him to a federal facility about an hour from where you are. This is completely voluntary. You can say no and we'll proceed without his testimony. But Sheila, what he's offering could not only clear your name completely, it could bring down the entire network that destroyed your life." I thought about Detective Martinez's words about my mother's past, about the web of corruption that had ensnared my family, about Amanda sitting in a California jail cell finally facing consequences for her actions. "I'll do it. I need to look him in the eye and hear him admit what he did." "There's something else," Jessica said, her voice dropping lower. "The FBI searched Tommy's cell yesterday and found something he'd been hiding for years. Letters from your family members. Letters that prove they knew exactly what they were doing when they convinced you to take the plea deal." My breath caught in my throat. "What kind of letters?" "I can't discuss the details over the phone, but let's just say your father's claim that he thought you'd only get manslaughter was a complete lie. They knew you'd get the death penalty, Sheila. They planned for it." The phone felt heavy in my hand. 7 years of believing that my family had made a terrible mistake, that they'd been misled by lawyers and overwhelmed by circumstances, that they genuinely thought they were saving both their daughters in the only way they could. But they'd known. They'd known I would die, and they'd decided that was acceptable. The next day dragged by with excruciating slowness. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Not the breakfast that tasted like cardboard, not the book I tried to read, not Rosa's attempts at conversation. My mind kept circling back to the same questions. What could Tommy Briggs possibly tell me that I didn't already know? What were these letters Jessica had mentioned? How much worse could this story get? The federal facility was a stark concrete building that looked more like an office complex than a prison. I was transported there in the back of an FBI van, handcuffed but treated with a courtesy I hadn't experienced in years. The agents spoke to me like I was a victim rather than a criminal, and that small shift in perception felt monumental after 7 years of being treated like I was dangerous. The interview room was nothing like the visiting rooms I was used to. There were cameras in every corner, recording equipment on the table, and 2 FBI agents flanking the door. Tommy Briggs sat across from me in an orange jumpsuit similar to mine, but he looked smaller than I'd expected. Older, too. Prison had aged him in ways that went beyond the gray at his temples and the lines around his eyes. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice was rough with what might have been regret. "You look like her, you know, like your mother." "I didn't come here to talk about my mother. But that's exactly why you're here," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Everything that happened to you, everything your family did, It all goes back to Linda Castellanos and what she cost my organization 28 years ago. Agent Rodriguez, the lead FBI investigator, activated the recording equipment with a soft click. Mr. Briggs, you understand that anything you say here will be recorded and may be used in legal proceedings? I understand, Tommy said, but his eyes never left my face. Shiela, do you know what your mother testified about in 1995? Detective Martinez said she witnessed a murder. She witnessed the execution of a federal informant, a man named Carlos Mendez, who'd been feeding information to the DEA about our West Coast distribution network. Your mother was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but when the FBI approached her, she didn't just cooperate. She volunteered additional information about our operations that she'd observed over several months. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was reeling. My mother hadn't just been a reluctant witness. She'd actively worked against these people. Her testimony led to the arrests of 15 people, including my older brother Miguel. He died in federal prison in 2003, but before he died, he made me promise that someday the Castellanos family would pay for what Linda had cost us. So you waited 22 years for revenge? I waited for the right opportunity. When Amanda started dating one of our low-level dealers in 2016, we saw our chance. She was young, stupid, desperate for money and attention. It wasn't hard to pull her deeper into the organization. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. How did you identify Amanda as Linda Castellanos' daughter? We'd been keeping loose tabs on Linda's family for years. Nothing active, just checking in occasionally to see where they were, what they were doing. When Linda died in 2014, we thought that was the end of it. But then Miguel's son got out of prison in 2016, and he wanted to honor his father's memory by completing the vendetta. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture so ugly I almost couldn't bear to look at it. So you used Amanda to get to me. We used Amanda to create an opportunity. The Patricia Reynolds murder was supposed to look like a simple robbery gone wrong, but Patricia was smarter than we anticipated. She figured out the money laundering scheme and threatened to expose it. Amanda panicked and killed her, but messily. There was too much evidence pointing back to our organization. So you needed a scapegoat. We needed someone whose conviction would end the investigation and close the case permanently. Amanda was too connected to our network. If she went to trial, too many uncomfortable questions would get asked. But you were perfect. Clean record, no obvious motive, just far enough removed from the organization that no one would dig deeper once they had their killer. Agent Rodriguez was taking notes rapidly. How did you convince the Martinez family to cooperate? Tommy's expression hardened. We didn't convince them of anything. We gave them a choice. They could sacrifice one daughter to save the other, or they could watch us destroy both daughters along with everyone else they cared about. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. You threatened them. We made our position clear. Amanda was going down for Patricia's murder one way or another. The evidence was overwhelming, but if the family could convince you to take the blame instead, Amanda could disappear, start over somewhere else, and the investigation would end with your conviction. And if they refused, then Amanda would go to trial, where her connections to our organization would inevitably come out, which would lead to investigations of everyone she'd been involved with, including her family members who'd been helping her launder money through their legitimate businesses. The room was spinning. What legitimate businesses? Your father's auto repair shop was processing cash for us for almost 2 years. Karen's real estate license was being used to facilitate property transfers. Even your Uncle Mark was on the payroll. He'd been feeding us information about ongoing investigations and helping us stay ahead of law enforcement. Agent Rodriguez looked up from his notes. Are you saying the entire Martinez family was involved in your criminal organization? Not the entire family, Tommy said, looking directly at me. Shiela was the only one who was completely clean. She had no idea what her family was involved in, which made her the perfect fall guy. Who's going to believe that an innocent diner waitress with no criminal connections could be framed by her own family? I understood now why my family had been so eager to sacrifice me. It hadn't just been about protecting Amanda, it had been about protecting themselves. They'd all been criminals, all been profiting from the same organization that had targeted me for revenge. When the choice came down to exposing their own crimes or letting me take the blame for Amanda's, it hadn't been a difficult decision. "The letters," I said quietly. "What were in the letters Jessica mentioned?" Tommy nodded to Agent Rodriguez, who pulled out a manila folder and extracted several sheets of paper. "These were found in Mr. Briggs's possession yesterday. They appear to be correspondence between him and various members of your family, discussing the plan to frame you." The first letter was in my father's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before Patricia's murder. The contents made my vision blur, with rage. "Tommy, we've discussed this with the lawyer and he confirms that with Sheila's clean record, she'll likely get life without parole instead of death if she pleads guilty to second-degree murder. This is acceptable to us. Karen is concerned about the psychological impact on Amanda of watching her sister go to prison, but we agree this is the best solution for everyone involved. Please confirm the timeline for implementing the evidence placement. Robert." The second letter was from Karen, written 2 days after my arrest. "The plea negotiations are going better than expected. Sheila's attorney is pushing for manslaughter, but the prosecutor is insisting on murder too. Either way, she'll be out of the picture permanently, and Amanda can start fresh in California like we discussed. The $50,000 payment cleared as agreed. Thank you for handling this professionally." The third letter was the worst. It was from Amanda herself, written from California just 6 months ago. "I heard through Dad that Sheila's execution date got moved up. Part of me feels bad about how this all worked out, but honestly, she was never going to amount to much anyway. At least this way her life serves a purpose. My daughter will never have to know about any of this ugliness. Thanks for giving me a second chance. A." I set the letters down with shaking hands. My own sister thought my life was worthless enough that my execution would actually be doing the world a favor. My father had negotiated my death sentence like it was a business transaction. Karen had been so pleased with the arrangement that she'd thanked Tommy for his professionalism. "There's one more thing," Tommy said, his voice softer now. "Your mother left something for you. Something she gave to my brother Miguel years ago as insurance, in case anything ever happened to her." Agent Rodriguez produced a small envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written on the front in my mother's familiar handwriting. She told Miguel that if our organization ever came after her family, he should make sure you got this. Miguel gave it to me before he died, and I've been carrying it around for years, waiting for the right moment. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was a letter from my mother, dated just a few months before her death. "My dearest Shiela," it read. "If you're reading this, it means the people I testified against have found a way to hurt our family. I've always known this day might come, and I've tried to prepare for it as best I can. There are things I never told you about my past, about why we left California, about the dangers that followed us to Texas. I testified against dangerous people because it was the right thing to do, but I've always known there might be consequences. If something happens to me, or if anyone in our family is ever accused of crimes we didn't commit, you need to know the truth. There is a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Austin, box number 347. The key is hidden in your baby book, taped inside the back cover. Inside the box, you'll find documents that prove everything. Recordings, photographs, financial records that show exactly who was involved in the organization I helped bring down. Use this information to protect yourself and your family. I love you more than words can express, and I'm sorry for any pain my choices have caused you. Be strong, be brave, and never let anyone convince you that you're worth less than you are. Mom. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. My mother had known this would happen. She'd tried to protect me even from beyond the grave, leaving me the tools I'd need to fight back against the people who wanted to destroy her family. The safety deposit box, I said to Agent Rodriguez. Has anyone checked it? We're obtaining a warrant now, he replied. If your mother's letter is accurate, those documents could provide evidence of criminal activity going back decades. I looked at Tommy, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Why are you telling me all this? Why help me now? Because Miguel's vendetta died with him, and I'm tired of carrying it around. What we did to you was wrong, even by criminal standards. You never hurt anyone, never committed any crimes, never deserved what happened to you. I can't give you back 7 years of your life, but I can at least make sure the people responsible face consequences. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward. Mr. Briggs, are you prepared to testify to all of this in court? To provide details about the conspiracy to frame Ms. Martinez? I'm prepared to testify to everything. The money laundering, the murder, the frame job, the corruption of law enforcement officials, all of it. In exchange, I want protection for my family and a reduced sentence recommendation. That will depend on the quality and completeness of your cooperation, Agent Rodriguez replied. But if everything you've told us today checks out, the federal prosecutor will likely be very interested in making a deal. As the interview concluded, and I was prepared for transport back to the prison, Tommy stopped me with one final comment. Your mother would be proud of you, he said. She always said you had her strength, her sense of justice. Miguel used to say that was why you had to be destroyed, because you were too much like her to ever give up fighting. He was right, I replied, and that's exactly why you're all going to lose. The ride back to the prison gave me time to process everything I'd learned. My family hadn't just betrayed me. They'd been criminals themselves, profiting from the same organization that had targeted me for revenge. They'd weighed my life against their own freedom and decided I was expendable. Even worse, they'd known I would receive the death penalty and had considered that an acceptable outcome. But my mother had seen this coming. She'd left me a way to fight back, a cache of evidence that could expose the entire network and prove my innocence beyond any doubt. For 7 years, I'd felt like I was fighting this battle alone, but I wasn't alone. My mother had been fighting alongside me from the beginning, reaching across the years to give me the weapons I needed. Back in my cell that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about justice. For the first time in 7 years, it felt like something more than just a fantasy. It felt like something I could actually achieve. Rosa noticed my change, in mood immediately. Something's different about you tonight, she said, looking up from her book. You look like someone who just figured out how to win a war. Maybe I did, I replied. Maybe I finally figured out that I've been fighting the wrong battle all along. What do you mean? I've been trying to prove I didn't commit a crime. But what I should have been doing is proving that other people did commit crimes. Lots of them. Rosa smiled. Sounds like those people are about to have a very bad time. She was right. Tomorrow, Agent Rodriguez would execute the warrant for my mother's safety deposit box. Jessica would file new motions based on Tommy's testimony. The investigation would expand to include everyone who'd been involved in the conspiracy against me. And for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't just surviving in prison. I was actively working to destroy the people who'd put me there. The truth was finally coming out, all of it, and I was ready to use it like the weapon it was always meant to be. The contents of my mother's safety deposit box arrived at the prison in 3 sealed evidence bags, each one containing pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for 7 years. Jessica spread the documents across the conference room table like she was laying out cards for the most important hand of poker ever played. Your mother was thorough, she said, her voice filled with something approaching awe. She didn't just collect evidence, she built an entire case file. The first bag contained photographs, dozens of them, showing people I recognized and people I didn't in what appeared to be business meetings. My father shaking hands with Tommy Briggs outside his auto repair shop. Karen signing documents while sitting next to a man I'd later learn was Miguel Castellanos, Tommy's brother. Uncle Mark in his police uniform, standing next to a car trunk filled with what looked like packages wrapped in plastic. These photos span 3 years, Jessica explained, pointing to timestamps in the corners. Your mother was documenting their activities long before Patricia Reynolds was murdered. She knew your family was involved with the same people she'd testified against, and she was gathering evidence. The second bag contained financial records that made my stomach turn. Bank statements showing regular deposits into accounts belonging to my father, Karen, and Uncle Mark. Wire transfer receipts with coded reference numbers that matched dates when I knew major drug busts had failed to materialize. Payment vouchers for consultation services that were clearly bribes. This shows a pattern of corruption going back to 2014, Jessica continued. Your uncle wasn't just helping them with your case. He'd been on their payroll for years, feeding them information about ongoing investigations, warning them about raids, even helping them identify potential witnesses who might cooperate with federal agents. But it was the third bag that contained the most damning evidence. Audio recordings, dozens of them, stored on small digital devices that looked ancient by today's standards, but had apparently captured conversations that would destroy lives and end careers. Jessica connected one of the devices to her laptop and clicked play. My father's voice filled the room, younger than I remembered it, but unmistakably his. The girl doesn't suspect anything, he was saying. She thinks we're just going through a rough patch financially. She has no idea the shop has been washing money for you people. Another voice, one I now recognized as Tommy Briggs, responded. Good. We need to keep it that way. If Linda's daughter finds out what we're doing, she might cause problems just like her mother did. Sheila's not like Linda, my father replied. She doesn't ask questions, doesn't get involved in things that don't concern her. As long as we keep her in the dark, she'll never be a problem. Jessica paused the recording and looked at me with compassion in her eyes. This was recorded in 2015, 2 years before the murder. They'd already identified you as a potential threat because of your mother's past. Play the rest, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The next recording was even worse. It was Karen's voice, discussing me like I was a piece of furniture they were considering getting rid of. Robert's too sentimental about Shiela, she was saying. He still sees her as his innocent little girl, but she's becoming a liability. She's starting to ask questions about why we can afford the new house, why Amanda never seems to worry about money. If she keeps digging, she's going to figure out what we're really involved in. So what do you suggest? This was a voice I didn't recognize, but Jessica's notes identified it as Miguel Castellanos. I suggest we start planning for the possibility that Shiela might need to be neutralized, Karen replied. Not killed. That would raise too many questions. But removed from the equation in a way that discredits anything she might say about our business arrangements. The word neutralized echoed in my head like a gunshot. 3 years before Patricia Reynolds was murdered, my stepmother was already planning my destruction. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because I might someday discover their crimes. Jessica played recording after recording, each one more damning than the last. Conversations about which judges could be bought. Discussions of how to frame evidence to ensure convictions stuck. Strategic planning sessions about how to eliminate witnesses who posed threats to their organization. And then finally, the recording that explained everything. It was dated 2 weeks before Patricia's murder, and it featured voices I recognized as my father, Karen, Uncle Mark, and Tommy Briggs. The Reynolds woman has to be dealt with immediately, Tommy was saying. She's scheduled to meet with federal agents in 4 days, and she has enough information to bring down our entire operation. Amanda can handle it, Uncle Mark replied. She's already established a relationship with Reynolds through the real estate transactions. It won't look suspicious if she shows up at the house. But what about afterward? This was my father's voice, heavy with what sounded like dread. If Amanda gets arrested for this, the investigation will lead straight back to all of us. That's where the Shiela solution comes in, Karen said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. We've been planning for this possibility for months. All the pieces are in place to make her look guilty instead. I don't like it, my father said. She's my daughter. She's Linda's daughter, Tommy corrected, and Linda cost us everything 20 years ago. It's time for her family to pay that debt in full. The girl's expendable anyway, Karen added. She's never going to amount to anything, never going to contribute anything meaningful to the world. At least this way her life serves a purpose. I had to ask Jessica to stop the recording. Hearing my stepmother casually dismiss my entire existence as worthless was more painful than 7 years of death row had been. These people hadn't just betrayed me. They'd dehumanized me to the point where my death seemed not just acceptable, but beneficial. There's more, Jessica said gently. Your mother left detailed notes explaining how she obtained these recordings. She'd been suspicious of your family's sudden financial improvements after your father married Karen, and she started investigating on her own. She discovered their connection to the same criminal organization she'd helped prosecute, and she began gathering evidence to protect you. She handed me a handwritten letter in my mother's careful script. Shiela, it read, by the time you read this, the people I testified against will have found a way to hurt our family. I've been watching your father and his new wife get involved with dangerous people, and I know they don't understand the risks they're taking. I've tried to warn Robert, but he won't listen. Karen has convinced him that working with these criminals is the only way to provide for their family. What they don't realize is that these people never forget, and they never forgive. I fear that someday they will use Robert's involvement to hurt you, either as leverage against him or as revenge against me. If that day comes, use this evidence to protect yourself. Don't trust anyone in our family. Their loyalty has been bought and paid for. Trust only yourself, and trust the law when you have enough evidence to make it work for you instead of against you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this, but I've given you the tools to protect yourself. Use them wisely. All my love, Mom. The letter was dated just 2 months before my mother's death. She'd known what was coming, had tried to prepare for it, and had died knowing that her daughter would someday need weapons to fight a war she couldn't prevent. This changes everything, Jessica said, gathering the documents back into their evidence bags. With these recordings and financial records, we can prove that your conviction was the result of a criminal conspiracy involving multiple law enforcement officials and government employees. We can prove that evidence was planted, witnesses were coerced, and the entire investigation was compromised from the beginning. What happens now? Now we go on the offensive. I'm filing a motion for immediate dismissal of all charges against you based on prosecutorial misconduct and newly discovered evidence. The State Attorney General is convening a grand jury to investigate corruption in the police department and the DA's office. And the FBI is preparing arrest warrants for everyone involved in the conspiracy. Including my family? Jessica's expression hardened. Especially your family. Your father, Karen, and Uncle Mark are all facing federal charges for racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Amanda is already facing murder charges in California, and now she'll also be charged federally for her role in the money laundering operation. The idea of my entire family being arrested should have brought me satisfaction, but mostly I just felt empty. These people had raised me, claimed to love me, shared holidays and birthdays and ordinary moments that had felt real at the time. Learning that it had all been a lie, that I'd been nothing more than a convenient scapegoat from the beginning, was almost too much to process. There's something else you need to know, Jessica continued. Detective Martinez has been in contact with your mother's sister in California. Apparently, Linda had been sending her copies of evidence for years, creating a backup in case something happened to the originals. Your Aunt Carmen has been waiting for the right moment to come forward. My mother had a sister. In 7 years of imprisonment, none of my family had ever mentioned that I had relatives who might care about what happened to me. But of course they wouldn't. Carmen might have asked inconvenient questions about why her niece was on death row. She wants to meet with you, Jessica said. She's flying in from Los Angeles tomorrow. The next day, Carmen Delgado walked into the prison conference room looking so much like my mother that I almost couldn't breathe. She was older, probably in her early 60s, with gray-streaked hair and the same brown eyes that had looked back at me from mirrors my entire life. "Mija," she said, her voice breaking as she sat down across from me. "I've been fighting to get to you for 7 years." "Fighting how?" "Writing letters to governors, hiring private investigators, trying to find attorneys who would listen to me when I said you couldn't have committed murder. Your father's people told everyone that Linda's family didn't want contact, that we blamed you for bringing shame on the family name. Another lie, another manipulation designed to isolate me completely from anyone who might help. You never believed I was guilty?" "Never for a second. You're Linda's daughter. You have her heart, her sense of right and wrong. Even as a little girl, you couldn't lie convincingly about stealing cookies. You could never have killed someone." Carmen reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Your mother sent me copies of everything over the years. Every recording, every photograph, every document. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would use this evidence to protect you. Why didn't you come forward before?" "I tried. But no one would listen to a woman from California claiming her niece had been framed by corrupt cops in Texas. The private investigators I hired kept hitting dead ends. Witnesses who wouldn't talk, records that had mysteriously disappeared, attorneys who suddenly became unavailable. It wasn't until Detective Martinez contacted me 6 months ago that I realized someone was finally taking this seriously." She opened the envelope and spread out documents that looked identical to the ones we'd found in my mother's safety deposit box. "These are the originals." Linda didn't trust banks entirely, so she kept copies with family and originals in her deposit box. She was paranoid, but it turned out she had good reason to be. "Tell me about my mother," I said. "Tell me about the person she was before all this happened." Carmen's face softened. "Linda was the bravest person I ever knew. When she witnessed that murder in 1995, she didn't have to come forward. She could have kept quiet, minded her own business, stayed safe. But she said that if she didn't speak up, more people would die. She said that sometimes you have to risk everything to do what's right. And she paid for it her whole life." She did, but she never regretted it. Even when we had to leave California, even when she had to change her name and look over her shoulder for years, she said she'd make the same choice again. She said that evil people only win when good people stay silent. I thought about that philosophy as Carmen continued talking about my mother's life before I was born. Linda had been a teacher, passionate about social justice, involved in community activism. She'd been the kind of person who couldn't ignore injustice even when it would have been safer to do so. "She would be so proud of you," Carmen said as our visit came to an end. "Surviving 7 years on death row for a crime you didn't commit, never giving up hope, still fighting for the truth. That's exactly the kind of strength she had." "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "I feel like I've been broken into pieces and I'm just now figuring out how to put myself back together." "Strength isn't about never breaking," Carmen replied. "It's about deciding to rebuild yourself even when everyone else has given up on you." That night, back in my cell, I lay awake thinking about everything that was about to happen. Tomorrow, Jessica would file motions that would begin the process of overturning my conviction. Federal agents would start executing arrest warrants for the people who'd destroyed my life. My family would finally face consequences for their crimes. But, more than that, I would finally have the chance to step out of the shadow of their betrayal and become the person my mother had raised me to be. Not the expendable daughter, not the convenient scapegoat, but a woman with her own voice and her own power. Rosa was reading by the small light over her bunk, occasionally glancing at me with concern. Finally, she put her book down and said, "You look like someone who's about to change the world." "Maybe just my little corner of it," I replied. "But that's a start. What's the first thing you're going to do when you get out of here?" I thought about that question. For 7 years, I'd dreamed of freedom without really believing it would ever come. Now that it was within reach, I realized I didn't want just freedom. I wanted justice. Not just for myself, but for every other person who'd been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect them. "I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else," I said. "I'm going to use my story, use the evidence my mother left me, use everything I've learned in here to change the system that allowed this to happen." "Sounds like you've got your work cut out for you." "The best work always is." The next morning brought news that made the long wait worthwhile. Jessica called to tell me that my charges had been dismissed, that federal arrest warrants had been executed, and that I would be released within 24 hours. But the best news was that my story was already starting to make a difference. Media outlets were picking up the case. Legal organizations were using it as an example of why the death penalty needed reform, and other wrongfully convicted people were coming forward with their own stories of corruption and betrayal. My mother's fight for justice hadn't ended with her death. It had continued through me. And now it would continue through everyone who heard our story and decided to keep fighting. The truth was finally out, all of it, and it was more powerful than any of us had imagined. The morning of my release, I woke before dawn and sat on the edge of my narrow bunk, staring at the concrete wall I'd been looking at for 7 years. In a few hours, I would walk out of this place a free woman, completely exonerated, with a future I could finally control. But freedom felt more terrifying than I'd expected. Rosa was already awake, sitting quietly on her own bunk, giving me space to process the enormity of what was happening. Finally, she broke the silence. "You scared?" "Terrified," I admitted. "I've been in here so long, I don't even know how to be a person in the real world anymore." "You'll figure it out," she said with quiet confidence. "You're stronger than you think, and you've got something most people don't have." "What's that?" "A purpose. You know exactly why you're walking out of here and what you're going to do with your freedom. That's more than most people have, inside or outside these walls." The paperwork for my release took 3 hours. 3 hours of signatures and forms and official stamps, while Jessica stood beside me explaining each document and what it meant for my future. Full exoneration. All charges dismissed. Criminal record expunged. Financial compensation from the state pending final resolution of the federal investigation. But more importantly, I was walking out as a symbol of everything that was wrong with a system that had nearly executed an innocent woman, while the real criminals walked free. "The media is waiting outside," Jessica warned me as we prepared to leave the administrative building. "There are reporters from every major network, plus documentary filmmakers, podcast producers, and representatives from various legal organizations. You don't have to talk to any of them if you're not ready." I thought about my mother's philosophy, about the importance of speaking up even when it was dangerous. I want to talk to them. People need to hear this story. The moment I stepped, outside, camera flashes exploded around me like fireworks. Reporters shouted questions while microphones thrust toward my face, but I held up my hand for silence. 7 years ago, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the parking lot, my own family convinced me to plead guilty to a murder I didn't commit. They told me it was the only way to save my sister from a life sentence. What they didn't tell me was that they'd been paid to sacrifice me, that my death had been planned and orchestrated by people who wanted revenge against my mother for doing the right thing decades earlier. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I'm standing here today not because the system worked, but because it failed so completely that the truth couldn't stay buried forever. If my mother hadn't been brave enough to gather evidence, if Detective Martinez hadn't cared enough to request DNA testing, if Attorney Torres hadn't fought for me when everyone else had given up, I would have been executed in 8 days for Amanda's crime. A reporter called out, "What's your message for other people who might be in similar situations?" Never stop fighting for the truth, even when everyone around you is invested in the lie. And never trust anyone who asks you to sacrifice yourself for their convenience, even if they're family. Blood doesn't make someone worthy of your loyalty. Their actions do. What do you want people to know about your family? I want people to know that my father, my stepmother, and my uncle are sitting in federal prison right now where they belong. They're facing charges for racketeering, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and accessory to murder. My sister Amanda is awaiting trial for the murder she actually committed. The truth has consequences, and they're finally facing theirs. What's next for you? I looked out at the sea of faces, thinking about all the people who might be watching this coverage, all the wrongfully convicted people still sitting in cells, all the families torn apart by corruption and lies. I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else. I'm starting a foundation to investigate cases where family members may have been coerced into false confessions or wrongful guilty pleas. I'm working with legal organizations to reform laws that allow this kind of manipulation. And I'm going to tell my story anywhere people will listen, because silence is what allows these injustices to continue. The press conference lasted another hour, with questions about the investigation, the corruption that had been uncovered, and my plans for the civil lawsuit against the state. Through it all, I felt my mother's presence with me, guiding my words, giving me strength. When it was over, Jessica drove me to a hotel where Aunt Carmen was waiting. The suite she'd booked overlooked the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in more natural light than I'd seen in years. I stood at the window, for a long time, just watching people move freely on the streets below, remembering what it felt like to have choices. "I brought you something," Carmen said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a gold necklace with a pendant that looked like it had been worn smooth by years of handling. "It was your mother's," she explained. "She wore it every day, from the time she testified until the day she died. She said it reminded her that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified." I fastened the necklace around my throat, feeling the weight of it settle against my skin like a promise. My mother's courage, passed down to me, ready to be used in the battles ahead. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, and meetings with advocacy organizations. The federal investigation had expanded beyond my case to examine dozens of other convictions that might have been tainted by the same corruption network. Detective Martinez had been promoted to head a new task force specifically focused on wrongful convictions involving law enforcement misconduct. Amanda's trial began 2 months after my release. I sat in the gallery every day, watching my sister finally face consequences for her actions. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, beaten down by months in custody and the weight of everyone finally knowing the truth about what she'd done. When she took the stand in her own defense, she tried to paint herself as another victim of Tommy Briggs's organization, a young woman who'd been manipulated and coerced into committing murder. But the recordings from my mother's evidence cache told a different story. They showed Amanda as an active participant in the money laundering operation, someone who'd killed Patricia Reynolds to protect her own criminal enterprise. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on first-degree murder charges. As the bailiff led Amanda away in shackles, She looked at me for the first time since the trial began. "I'm sorry," she mouthed, but the words felt empty, meaningless after everything that had happened. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to her. My father's trial was harder to watch. Robert Martinez, the man who'd taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework, sat at the defendant's table looking decades older than his actual age. The prosecution played recording after recording of his voice discussing my frame-up, like it was a business transaction, calculating the cost-benefit analysis of my death. When he testified in his own defense, he claimed he'd been coerced by threats against his family, that he'd believed I would only receive a life sentence, that he'd never intended for me to actually be executed. But the evidence showed otherwise. The recordings proved he'd known exactly what he was doing, and the letters found in Tommy's possession showed he'd been comfortable with my death as long as it protected his other interests. The jury found him guilty on all counts. As he was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, he looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said. "I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I am sorry." "You taught me that actions matter more than words," I replied, my voice steady. "These are the consequences of your actions." Uncle Mark's trial was the most satisfying. Watching a corrupt cop finally face justice for the lives he'd destroyed felt like vindication not just for me, but for every person he'd railroaded over the years. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Financial records showing bribes, testimony from other criminals about information he'd sold, and most damning of all, recordings of him planning the evidence manipulation in my case. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison and stripped of his pension. As he was led away, he looked at me with pure hatred, no longer bothering to pretend he felt any remorse for what he'd done. Karen's trial was the quickest. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of her co-conspirators, she accepted a plea deal that would put her in prison for 15 years. She never looked at me during the proceedings, never acknowledged my presence in the courtroom. To the end, she remained convinced that she'd done nothing wrong, that I'd been an acceptable sacrifice for her family's financial security. Tommy Briggs received a life sentence for Patricia Reynolds' murder and his role in the broader conspiracy. In exchange for his cooperation, he avoided the death penalty, but he would never see freedom again. His organization was dismantled, with dozens of arrests and convictions stemming from the evidence my mother had gathered over the years. The civil lawsuit against the state took longer to resolve, but eventually, I received a settlement of $12 million. $1 million for each year I'd spent wrongfully imprisoned, plus additional compensation for the trauma of living on death row. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, and I immediately began using it to fund the foundation I'd promised to create. The Linda Castellanos Foundation for Justice became a reality 6 months after my release. We investigated cases of potential wrongful convictions, provided legal support for families dealing with corrupt law enforcement, and lobbied for legislative changes to prevent the kind of manipulation I'd experienced. Our first major case involved a teenager in Arizona who'd been pressured by his family to confess to a crime his older brother had committed. Using the investigative techniques I'd learned from my own experience, we uncovered evidence of police, coercion, and family manipulation that led to his exoneration after 3 years in juvenile detention. The second case was even more complex. A woman in Florida, whose in-laws had convinced her to take the blame for financial crimes they'd committed, claiming it would be better for her children if she served time instead of their biological father. We discovered a pattern of emotional abuse and financial manipulation that had made her vulnerable to their coercion, and we helped her overturn her conviction while exposing the real criminals. With each case we solved, I felt my mother's mission continuing through me. She'd died believing that speaking up for justice was worth any personal cost, and now I was carrying that philosophy forward into a new generation. 1 year after my release, I stood in the same prison where I'd spent 7 years of my life, but this time, I was there as a visitor. I'd been invited to speak to the women on death row about hope, about fighting for justice even when everything seemed hopeless. The conference room where I spoke had been the same one where I'd met with Jessica so many times, planning the legal strategy that had saved my life. Now it was filled with women wearing the same orange jumpsuits I'd worn, facing the same countdown to execution I'd endured. I know what it feels like to believe that everyone has given up on you, I told them. I know what it's like to watch other women die while you wait your turn. I know what it's like to feel like your life doesn't matter to anyone. A woman in the front row raised her hand. How did you keep going? How did you not just give up? I remembered that my life had value, even if the people around me couldn't see it. I remembered that the truth doesn't stop being true just because people choose to ignore it. And I held on to the belief that justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. Another woman asked, "What if your family is the problem? What if the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones destroying you?" "Then you protect yourself," I replied. "You find new family among people who see your worth. You fight for yourself with the same energy you would fight for someone you love. Because you deserve that love, especially from yourself." When the session ended, several women approached me with their own stories of family betrayal, of being pressured to accept guilt for crimes they hadn't committed, of being abandoned by people who claimed to love them. I gave each one my contact information and promised that the foundation would look into their cases. Walking out of that prison as a free woman, knowing I would never have to return as an inmate, felt like closing a chapter of my life that had defined me for too long. I wasn't the wrongfully convicted woman anymore. I wasn't the expendable daughter or the sacrificial victim. I was Shiela Martinez, founder of an organization dedicated to preventing injustice, advocate for the wrongfully convicted, and living proof that the truth has power even when it takes years to surface. 2 years after my release, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Amanda, written from the federal prison where she was serving her life sentence. "Shiela," it read, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I know what I did was unforgivable. I let you sit on death row for 7 years for a crime I committed, and I told myself it was justified because you were stronger than me, because you could handle it better. I was wrong. I was selfish and cowardly, and I destroyed your life to protect mine. I think about what I did every day, and I will for the rest of my life. I know you probably never want to hear from me again, but I needed you to know that I understand now what I cost you. I understand that strength isn't about being able to survive injustice, it's about fighting to prevent it. You're the strongest person I know, and I'm sorry it took me 7 years in your place on death row to realize it." I read the letter several times, then filed it away without responding. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive, not because forgiveness is wrong, but because some people don't deserve the energy it takes to offer it. Instead, I focused on the future. The foundation had grown into a national organization with offices in 12 states. We'd helped exonerate 47 people in our first 2 years, and we'd lobbied successfully for legislation requiring independent oversight of cases involving family coercion. I'd also found something I never expected to find again: love. David Chen was an investigative journalist who'd covered my case from the beginning, and over months of working together on foundation projects, we developed a relationship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. He understood that my past would always be part of me, that I would always carry the scars of 7 years on death row. But he also saw who I was becoming, the woman I was choosing to be rather than the victim I'd been forced to become. On the 3rd anniversary of my release, we held a gala to raise funds for the foundation. The ballroom was filled with attorneys, advocates, formerly incarcerated people, and families who'd been helped by our work. As I stood at the podium to give the keynote address, I looked out at faces that represented hope, justice, and the power of truth to change lives. 3 years ago, I began. I walked out of prison after spending 7 years on death row for a crime I didn't commit. I was angry, broken, and unsure if I could ever trust anyone again. Tonight, I stand before you as proof that trauma doesn't have to define you. That betrayal doesn't have to destroy you, and that justice, however delayed, is always worth fighting for. I talked about my mother's legacy, about the courage it takes to speak truth to power, about the importance of protecting vulnerable people from those who would exploit them. I talked about the Foundation's work and our plans for the future. But mostly, I talked about hope. About the fact that even in the darkest circumstances, even when everyone has given up on you, even when the system seems designed to destroy you, the truth has a power that can't be suppressed forever. My family tried to erase me, I concluded. They calculated my worth against their convenience and decided I was expendable. But they were wrong. I wasn't expendable then, and I'm not expendable now. None of us are. We all have value, we all deserve justice, and we all have the power to fight for both. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but more important than the applause were the conversations that followed. People approached me with their own stories, their own battles against injustice, their own commitments to making the world better. As the evening wound down and I prepared to leave, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Ms. Martinez," she said, "my brother is sitting in prison right now because our family convinced him to take the blame for something our father did. I've been trying to find someone to help him for 2 years. After hearing your story tonight, I know I can't give up." I handed her my business card. "Call me tomorrow. We'll help him." That's what this was all about. Not revenge against the people who'd betrayed me, not bitterness about the years I'd lost, but using my experience to prevent other families from being destroyed by the same kind of corruption and manipulation. Driving home that night with David beside me, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Detective Martinez shortly after my release. He'd asked me what I wanted my legacy to be, what I hoped people would remember about my story. "I want them to remember that family isn't just about blood," I'd told him. "It's about people who show up for you when everything goes wrong. I want them to remember that strength isn't about accepting injustice. It's about fighting against it. And I want them to remember that the truth always wins in the end, even when it takes longer than we think we can survive." Looking back now, I realized that's exactly what had happened. The family that mattered wasn't the one that had betrayed me, but the one I'd chosen: Jessica, Detective Martinez, Aunt Carmen, David, and all the people who'd fought alongside me for justice. The strength I'd needed hadn't come from accepting my fate, but from refusing to accept it. And the truth had won, completely and decisively. My mother's fight for justice hadn't ended with her death. It had continued through me, and now it would. Continue through everyone who heard our story and decided to keep fighting. 7 years on death row had nearly destroyed me. But in the end, it had also created me. Not as a victim, but as a force for change. Not as someone who accepted injustice, but as someone who fought against it wherever it existed. I was Shiela Martinez, and I was exactly who I was supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.